Nintendo brings us the delightful Balloon Kid on Game Boy Works Episode 93. It seems somehow fitting that here, in the same week that Nintendo publishes a long-awaited remake of Metroid 2, that we should look back at the game that did the Metroid 2 thing first. Nintendo went from notable name to permanent household fixture with the NES console, and the company created a clear and direct line of succession to the NES with the Super NES. Of course, around the same time, they also created the Game Boy. And just as Nintendo's game console line had branches and divisions, so too did the company's internal structure. The distinct development groups within Nintendo tended to gravitate toward different consoles. Shigeru Miyamoto's Entertainment Analysis division focused its efforts wholly on Super NES as the 80s wound down, putting their full resources into 4 impressive launch titles for the system. Meanwhile, it had been Gunpei Yokoi's R&D 1 division that had masterminded the Game Boy, so, unsurprisingly, that group applied a laser focus on developing handheld games. Those first few games were a bit hit or miss, but we're almost a year and a half into the Game Boy's life at this point, and we're starting to see a bit of refinement as R&D 1's programmers and contractors find their footing within the handheld's limitations. We're also seeing a new phenomenon unfold, beginning here with Balloon Kid, the Game Boy as host platform for the true sequels to R&D 1's NES hits. Now, we already saw R&D 1 put together an NES follow-up back at launch with Super Mario Land. That was different though. Mario Land's team had worked on several early Mario games, but not on Super Mario Bros. And its sequels. Yet Mario Land definitely followed on from Super Mario Bros. In terms of design. However, no one on the planet looked at Super Mario Land and said, "Ah yes, this is the next Mario game, the true sequel." It was clearly a side story meant to slot in between Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario World, featuring a never-before-seen princess, a never-before-seen villain, and a never-before-seen kingdom. Balloon Kid, on the other hand, absolutely feels like the true sequel to NES classic Balloon Fight. It takes that simple game and expands on it with a more rigid structure, a wider array of play mechanics, and even something akin to a story. R&D 1 would more famously take this approach with a number of their other NES projects, most famously Metroid 2 and Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters. Balloon Kid tends to go overlooked and unregarded in the annals of Nintendo history, and yet it very much represents a continuation of a beloved NES creation. The original Balloon Fight, as you'll recall from NES Works, saw Nintendo uncharacteristically working in shameless clone mode, lifting the game's design and mechanics from Williams Arcade's smash Joust almost wholesale. Still, the 2-player cooperative arena action was every bit as fun as in the game that inspired it, and the NES version featured an addictive bonus mode called Balloon Trip, accompanied by a melody that makes it impossible to hate. Balloon Kid retains the standard Balloon Fight game, calling it Versus Mode, and it pulls in Balloon Trip as well. But while those represented the entirety of the NES cartridge, Balloon Kid demotes them to mere secondary modes. Instead, the focus here rests solely on the Story Mode, an 8-stage variant on Balloon Trip in which a girl named Alice wings her way right to left in an effort to rescue her idiot brother. Balloon Kid reverses the usual direction of platforming action, it reverses video game gender roles, and it reverses the myth of Icarus. Alice's brother carried too many balloons at once and vanished into the sky, like the fraudulent Balloon Boy hoax from a few years back. While it draws its general design from Balloon Trip with its auto-scrolling action across the sky, Balloon Kid adds a lot to the sandbox. For one thing, the hazards you need to avoid are a lot more diverse than the tiny star sparks of Balloon Trip. Alice has to dodge birds, lightning bolts, balloon fight bad guys, and more. She even has to fight bosses, which she accomplishes by dropping onto their heads. Alright, that's the biggest change here. While Balloon Kid definitely emphasizes flight, the game falls very clearly into the platformer genre, adding ground-based mechanics to the mix. At any point you can press the B button to cause Alice to drop her balloons, and become grounded. On the ground, she plays pretty much like any other platform game hero, running and jumping, though her controls are a bit slippery, and her jump is a little tough to get a handle on thanks to its floatiness and Alice's tendency to rebound off platforms at vigorous angles. While dropping Alice to the ground would seem to be antithetical to the entire premise of a game centered on flying around on balloons, it's not a permanent affliction. While on the ground, you can tap down on the D-pad to inflate a replacement balloon. 4 taps fully inflates a balloon, and 8 gives you 2 balloons. Running around becomes necessary to complete the game, especially in later levels. Many times you'll have to squeeze through areas too narrow for balloons to fit into, and most of the game's secrets, including bonus stages hidden inside giant Game Boys, require you to duck through such narrow passages. There's a lot of nuance to Alice's ability to release her balloons. For one thing, the balloons don't simply disappear once you let go. Instead, they float gently away, and it's entirely possible to leap up and grab them again right away. In fact, that's more or less how you beat the game's bosses. Drop onto their heads from a low altitude, then use the rebound to snatch your balloons back immediately. It's worth noting that most aerial enemies can't actually harm Alice. They act more like pinball bumpers and cause her to ricochet away. Instead, flying monsters pose a threat to Alice's balloons. Most of the game's world consists of wide expanses of open water, and if she drops into the water, she loses a life. Not so much because she can't swim, as because of the giant, hungry fish lurking in the ocean. As in Balloon Fight, enemies have a lot of pointy bits and will pop one of Alice's 2 balloons upon contact. You can float around with just a single balloon if need be, but having a second inflated provides a sort of buffer. Anytime you find yourself with only a single balloon, you can drop onto a patch of solid ground and pump up a replacement. This doesn't exactly turn Balloon Kid into a cakewalk, though. Unlike aerial enemies, the hazards you encounter on the ground can do Alice bodily harm and must be avoided at all costs. That can be tricky in tight spaces thanks to the girl's slippery controls, and it's no coincidence that the game's difficulty spikes wildly in the last 3 stages, right around the time you're forced to undertake a number of ground-based platforming challenges. Balloon Kid is a bit of a breeze up until that point, but once you're forced to spend extended periods without flight, you finally get to see the murder that was gleaming in the game's eyes. Despite the fact that Balloon Kid goes from lightweight romp to a steam-crushing death gauntlet in its final legs, it's a great little game. The multiplayer gives it plenty of replay value even beyond the standard mode, and the new take on the NES's Balloon Trip is one of the most challenging things I've ever played. With its controls and physics retuned to match the core story mode, Balloon Trip on Game Boy is crazy hard. Probably because the newly retuned mechanics were based around a more forgiving game design in which players could take a hit and still survive, and even pause to restore their missing balloon. Balloon Trip is all one-hit kills and aerial maneuvering, and it's absolutely unforgiving. In a lot of ways, Balloon Kid feels like the sort of culmination of the pre-Metroid work by director Yoshio Sakamoto and R&D 1. The team really loved the idea of auto-scrolling platformers with inventive control schemes. Think Gyromite's Sleepwalker mode or Sakamoto's own Gumshoe for NES. Balloon Kid marries those concepts to Balloon Fight to create basically the definitive R&D 1 auto-scrolling platformer. Balloon Kid shares another similarity with Gumshoe. It appears to have been designed specifically for US and European release. The Game Boy version of Balloon Kid never shipped in Japan. Instead, co-developer Pax Softnica reworked it for Sanrio as a Famicom game called Hello Kitty World. The original Game Boy creation wouldn't make its way to Japanese handheld enthusiasts for a full decade after its American debut, where it shipped as Balloon Fight GB. Japan got the last laugh there though, as Balloon Fight GB appeared on Game Boy Color with a nice, bright visual overhaul. As an aside, I hunted high and low specifically for a copy of Balloon Fight GB the first time I ever visited Japan back in 2001, but I had zero luck in finding it, because it never received a retail release. It was only available through the Nintendo Power flashcard system, meaning that the only physical copies of it remaining in the world are either bootlegs or flashcards that have yet to be purged by their owners. It's also worth noting that you can see Nintendo's localization philosophy taking shape here. The game's first stage takes place against a backdrop of school implements, including pencils, so Inoue's writers declared her and her dippy brother to be residents of Pennsylvania. Nintendo wouldn't do much with the Balloon Fight concept beyond Balloon Kid. This really feels like the ultimate expression of the premise of people floating around on balloons. And rather than belabor the point, the studio was content to draw a line under this one and call it a day. Balloon Fight has shown up from time to time in cameos throughout games like Animal Crossing and Smash Bros., And about 10 years ago, Nintendo and Vanderpool created a Balloon Fight remake for DS, starring omnipresent Legend of Zelda weirdo Tingle. Alas, Tingle's Balloon Fight only shipped in Japan and strictly as a Club Nintendo reward, but it's pretty easy to get a hold of these days. Though sadly it was based strictly on the NES and Versus Unisystem versions of Balloon Fight, and lacked an analog to Balloon Kid's Great Story Mode. Nintendo did republish Balloon Kid on 3DS Virtual Console, and unlike Maru's Mission, it's definitely worth the $4 they're asking for it, despite the lack of support for multiplayer in that reissue. This is a fun, charming little adventure, and the ability to weasel your way through the hard parts with save states makes it the total breeze that the Game Boy release isn't. R&D 1 would follow up with more sequels to their most famous NES works, but this is a great start. Sure, Game Boy lacked the power of the Super NES, but for a fairly simple and lightweight game like Balloon Kid, the monochrome portable was absolutely perfect, making this a Game Boy classic. Next on Game Boy Works, we'll rack up a substantial debt by buying vowels.